What would you do if your HOA tried to fine you for fishing on the lake you legally own? I remember the morning it all started. I was standing on my own dock, rod in hand, when the HOA president marched up with a clipboard and told me I was breaking community rules. That was the moment something in me tightened. I knew something was off, something bigger than a simple fine. And as I followed the trail of their paperwork, I uncovered a truth they never expected me to find. The morning had started the way I wished every morning would. Quiet, slow, the kind of stillness only a Wyoming ranch could hold. The air was cool enough that I could see the faintest puff of my breath drifting over the water. The lake behind my cabin lay perfectly calm, a sheet of silvery blue glass stretching out under the pale sunrise. Cottonwoods along the shoreline trembled in the breeze, their leaves flickering like coins. It was a place I had worked half my life to afford. 14 acres of rolling land, a private lake fed by an underground spring, and a small wooden dock I'd built with my own hands. I'd been there since dawn, boots planted on the old planks, coffee steaming in my left hand, fishing line drifting lazily in the water. It was the one ritual that still brought me peace after everything I had been through. The lake was the first thing that made me feel whole again after losing so much. Out here, no one expected anything from me. No deadlines, no noise, no neighbors arguing over fences or taxes. Just wind, water, and room to breathe. But peace never lasts long when an HOA is involved. I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. Light, deliberate steps, not the curious shuffle of a neighbor, but the clipped confidence of someone who believed they belonged everywhere. I turned, expecting maybe a delivery or Marcus, the sheriff, dropping by early. Instead, I saw a figure standing at the narrow dirt path leading down to my dock. A woman, mid-50s, stern posture, hair pinned back so tight it barely moved in the wind. She wore a navy windbreaker embroidered with Pine Ridge Estates HOA, a clipboard tucked against her chest like a badge of authority. Bethany Reed, the president of the HOA that governed the subdivision 2 miles down the hill, the one I wasn't a part of. She didn't wave, didn't greet, didn't ask permission to approach. She stepped off the path and onto the rocky bank, planting herself squarely between me and the rising sun, casting a long diagonal shadow across the water. My line trembled slightly as a fish tugged below, but I didn't move. My eyes were on her, and hers on me. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," she said, voice smooth but sharp enough to slice through the quiet. Or perhaps not so good. I let the silence sit. "Bethany," I finally said, "you're a long way from your neighborhood." She ignored that. With a single practiced motion, she lifted her clipboard, clicked her pen, and began writing. "I'm required to notify you that you are in violation of Pine Ridge Estates Community Regulation 14B, subsection 4, fishing in common use waters without HOA authorization." For a moment, I wondered if the cold lake mist had gotten into my ears. "Common use waters?" I repeated. "This is my lake." Bethany Reed didn't even blink. She turned her head slightly, as though surveying the shoreline like a queen evaluating land she planned to annex. "This body of water has been designated as a shared recreational feature for the surrounding community. Effective last quarter. Notices were distributed by mail." "To your residence," I said. "Not to me." She gave a small, tight smile, the kind that wasn't meant to comfort, just to remind you who thought they were in charge. "You received one as well. Or you should have. As property adjacent to a community amenity, you fall under review." I laughed once. Not because it was funny, but because it was so surreal that laughter was the only thing that kept me from saying something I'd regret later. "Bethany, this lake isn't adjacent. This lake is mine." She finally lowered her clipboard, but only to extend a paper toward me. A fine has been issued for unauthorized recreational activity. $500. Due within 10 business days. The breeze lifted the edge of the paper, flapping it like a flag of nonsense. I didn't reach for it. "You're standing on my shore," I said plainly. "You know that, right?" "This area," she answered, gesturing vaguely at the trees, rocks, and water that had been on my deed long before she ever appeared in my life, "is part of what we consider a community environment. The HOA has elected to enforce appropriate standards for usage." The sun rose a little higher behind her, painting the lake in gold. And there she stood, blocking the light, blocking the view, blocking the truth, with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Someone who had gotten away with things for a very long time. I let my gaze move past her shoulder, over the mirrored surface of the lake. My lake. The one I'd paid for with 2 decades of sweat and 7 years of saving. The one the deed said belonged to me from the waterline to the deepest part of the basin. I knew every inch of that shoreline, the way a man knows his own scars. I lowered my coffee cup. "Bethany," I said quietly, "if this is community water—" The breeze settled. The birds fell silent. Even the current at the end of the dock seemed to pause. "Why is my name the only one on the deed?" For the first time since she'd arrived, a flicker crossed her expression. Thin, fleeting, like a hairline crack appearing in a polished stone. She recovered almost instantly, lips tightening into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm not here to debate ownership with you, Mr. Cole," she said, pressing the paper toward me again. "I'm here to ensure compliance. If you believe there is confusion, you may attend the HOA's next meeting and submit a request for review." "I'm not in your HOA," I reminded her. She gave a small tilt of her head, as if humoring a child. "That will be part of the conversation." Then she pivoted on her heel and walked up the trail as though the air itself parted for her. By the time she reached the ridge, her silhouette had become a dark slash against the brightening sky. The lake felt different the moment she was gone. Still beautiful, still mine, but the quiet had been disturbed in a way that didn't settle. I reeled in my lines slowly, my mind chewing on her tone, her wording, the confidence she carried like a second skin. By noon, I'd tried to put the whole encounter behind me. I split some firewood, fixed the latch on the barn door, and checked the fence line along the northern pasture. Normal chores, normal rhythm, but my thoughts kept circling back to the clipboard in her hand, and the way she'd spoken as if this land, my land, was just a blank space waiting to be colored in by her authority. I didn't realize how quickly things would escalate. Around 4 p.m., my phone buzzed with the first email notification, then another, and another. By the time I wiped the sawdust from my hands and checked the screen, there were 6 unread messages from addresses containing the phrase Pine Ridge HOA Communications. The subject line of the most recent one read, "Notice of violation, unauthorized use of community water resource, community water resource." I opened the message. It was written in the same polished, formal tone I'd come to expect from HOA bureaucrats. But this time, it had my full name spelled out in bold at the top. The body of the email cited Section 14B, subsections 2, 4, and 9, language about regulated recreational activities, maintenance of community amenities, and protection of shared environmental assets. Every line seemed designed to create the impression of ownership without ever stating it outright. I read it twice, then a third time, looking for the smoking gun, some sentence claiming legal control of the lake. But it wasn't there. The email was crafted like a fog bank, thick enough to create confusion, thin enough to avoid responsibility. I scrolled further and found an attached PDF titled Fine Assessment, Initial Notice, $500, Due in 10 business days. Paid to Pine Ridge Estates, HOA. The absurdity of it made me laugh again. But this time, it wasn't the kind of laugh that eased tension. It was the kind that sharpened it. I decided to check in-town mail just in case they'd slipped something into the postal system. My truck rumbled down the dirt road, dust trailing behind me like a long, pale ribbon. The sky had turned a soft orange as the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting the valley in that warm light that made everything look just a little more timeless. Old ranch houses, weathered fences, fields stretching out under the horizon. When I reached my mailbox, a fresh envelope sat inside. Thick, cream-colored, the kind people use when they want to look official. I tore it open right there on the roadside. Inside was a printed letter, almost the same language as the email, plus an additional sheet titled Community Guideline Amendment. It listed rules about quiet recreation, community access fishing zones, and environmental stewardship protocols. None of these applied to my property. None of these had ever been voted on by me. None of these mentioned legal jurisdiction. But they were written to make an average person think they had no choice but to comply. Cars from the subdivision started rolling by as I stood there reading. Big SUVs, glossy and spotless, with HOA-approved paint colors and lawn designs. A few drivers slowed enough to glance at me. One woman even lifted her chin with a look I'd seen before. The look of someone who believed she was on the right side of a dispute she didn't understand. Word was spreading. By the time I returned to my ranch, the sky had darkened and the wind had picked up, sweeping across the lake in long, silvery ripples. I stood at the shore again, the same spot where Bethany had stood that morning. I imagined her voice echoing in the air. Community water. I crouched and dipped my hand into the lake. The water was cold, clean, moving softly through the reeds. This lake had been here before the HOA, before the houses, before the manicured lawns and monthly dues. It had been part of the land deed since the 1960s, when a rancher named Fowler dug the first contour to deepen the basin for cattle. And now an HOA president with a clipboard claimed it as her community's playground? I walked back to the cabin as twilight deepened. The wooden steps creaked under my boots. I flicked on the porch light and set the stack of papers on the kitchen table. Emails printed out, fines, guidelines, legal jargon. The yellow bulb cast long shadows across the documents, making them look like props in a play about power rather than anything real. Yet they were real. Real enough to start turning neighbors against me. Real enough to cause trouble if I ignored them. Real enough that I couldn't shake the thought that something bigger was at play. As I reread the fine notice, a simple question rose again in my mind, stronger than before. What exactly were they hiding behind those words? I let the papers rest on the kitchen table and stepped back from them the way a man steps back from a snake he isn't sure is dead. Outside the window, the last of the light faded behind the ridgeline, leaving only the faint glow of the porch bulb stretching across the yard. The wind picked up, rattling the old screen door and carrying the clean mineral scent of the lake. I stood still for a long moment, listening to the slow shift of the night settling in around the ranch. Then I walked to the cabinet where I kept all the documents the previous owner had left me. Rolled maps, leather folders, stiff envelopes yellowing with age. I hadn't opened most of them since the day I bought the property. Back then, the only thing I'd cared about was that the deed was clean and the lake was included. No liens, no easements, no shared rights, just me and the water. But tonight, something told me to look again. The old drawer creaked as I slid it open. Dust rose in a faint cloud as I pulled out a thick file tied with cracked twine. A handwritten label on the front read, Cole Ranch, Historical Records. I carried it to the table and untied it slowly, careful not to tear the brittle paper. The first thing I saw were hand-drawn survey maps dated decades ago, inked in neat strokes by someone who knew the land intimately. The lake's outline looked almost identical to its present shape, though the shoreline was more irregular in the older sketches. Next came a thin, oil-stained booklet titled Water Rights, State of Wyoming, 1978. When I opened it, the musty smell of paper and time filled the room. My name wasn't on the original filings, of course. It was the former owner's. But the transfer paperwork I'd signed 5 years ago was stapled neatly to the front. Clear as day, in printed county language, all water usage, access, and maintenance rights transfer in full to the new owner. All rights. Not some, not shared, not community managed. Mine. I flipped the pages slowly, letting my eyes travel over the signatures, stamps, and notary seals. As a former hydrology engineer, I'd spent half my career buried in documents like these: permits, boundary certifications, watershed analyses. I knew the difference between a guideline and a governing instrument, and everything in that file reinforced what I already suspected. The HOA had no claim over the water, the shoreline, or anything within several hundred feet of the lake. So why act as if they did? I pulled another sheet from the pile, a deed transfer from the early 90s. The signature at the bottom belonged to a man named Fowler, the rancher who had expanded the lake by redirecting a spring and digging out an additional basin with a backhoe. I remembered reading about that somewhere. I traced the line on the map he'd drawn, showing exactly where the water line extended and how much land had been shaped to hold it. The lake had always been part of this ranch, always private. So Bethany's community water claim wasn't ignorance, it was intentional. A chill, not cold, but something older, deeper, settled down my spine as I gathered the documents into a neat stack. Outside, the wind brushed across the cabin walls, carrying the soft, rhythmic slap of small waves against the dock. I imagined the water moving in the dark, steady and patient, the same way it had been long before Pine Ridge Estates ever existed. I set the file down and walked toward the back room where I kept the large metal case with my own professional papers. Even though I'd left the engineering business years ago, I still kept my certifications and project records. Old habits die hard. I opened the case and pulled out a folder labeled Hydrology Authority Reports, personal copies. Inside were dozens of standard forms used for watershed designation and water resource management. I held one up, comparing it to the community amendment Bethany had mailed me. The differences were glaring. Hers used vague language. Mine used precise statutory terms. Hers referenced community stewardship. Mine referenced state code. No engineer, no hydrologist, no county clerk would ever confuse the two. Meaning she wasn't trying to confuse them. She was trying to confuse me. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed a hand over my beard as another thought surfaced. Quiet, unwelcome, but insistent. If she wasn't confused, what was she after? I stood and walked to the door, stepping out onto the porch. The boards groaned softly under my weight, worn smooth by years of boots and weather. The night air wrapped around me, cool, sharp, carrying the scent of pine and creek water drifting from the north ravine. I walked down the porch steps and toward the lake without turning on any lights. The moon had risen just enough to cast a faint reflection on the water. The dock stretched out like a dark finger into the still surface. I stopped at the edge of the bank, toes inches from the cool stones along the shore. I tried to imagine the lake the way Bethany described it, as a community amenity, something shared, something managed by committee meetings and newsletters. I tried, and I failed. Because this lake wasn't a swimming pool or a park built by developers. It wasn't something you put in a budget or assigned a maintenance schedule. It was a living piece of land, a natural part of the ranch that existed long before a single house in Pine Ridge Estates was constructed, and she knew it. I crouched and dipped my fingers into the lake again, feeling the cold seep into my skin. I watched gentle ripples bend the moon's reflection. Then I stood and let the water drip from my hand back into its home. It hit me then, not all at once, but in the slow, building way a storm gathers on the horizon. The HOA wasn't operating on misunderstanding. They weren't confused about boundaries. They weren't overreaching by accident. They were probing, testing, seeing how much they could take before someone pushed back. My phone buzzed in my pocket, dragging me from the thought. I checked the screen. Another email from the HOA, this one marked urgent, time-stamped at 9:52 p.m. The subject line read, "Clarification of Community Access Policy." I didn't open it, not yet. Instead, I walked back to the cabin, the gravel crunching beneath my boots, each step steady, methodical, purposeful. Inside, the lamp on the table cast a warm pool of light over the scattered documents. I sat down, picked up the deed, and stared at my name printed clearly across the top. My name, my land, my lake. The pieces were beginning to shift into place, slowly but undeniably. Something was happening behind those words Bethany used, something calculated. Paper alone wouldn't stop them, but paper might be exactly where their mistake was hiding. I slid the entire stack of old documents closer, peeled open the water rights booklet again, and read until the lamp flickered low. And as the night stretched long and quiet around the cabin, a single thought kept rising like a cold current from the depths. They thought I wouldn't understand what these papers really meant. They thought wrong. By morning, the wind had shifted. A colder front blew down from the Tetons, carrying a raw, early spring bite that curled around the cabin and rattled the gutters. I stepped onto the porch with a mug of hot coffee, and the lake hit my eyes like a sheet of hammered steel, darker, restless, alive. The world felt sharper than it had 24 hours earlier, as if the land itself sensed something stirring beneath the surface. And something was. I'd barely taken my second sip when the rumble of an engine drifted up the slope. A white SUV wound its way along the gravel road leading toward the subdivision. HOA vehicle, same make and model as the one Bethany drove yesterday. But this one wasn't hers. The windows were tinted, the chrome spotless, the wheels kicking up little spirals of dust as it turned into the cul-de-sac at the bottom of the hill. Then it stopped beside a black pickup truck. The pickup wasn't familiar. A man stepped out of it, mid-40s, tall, well-fed, with that polished look developers seemed to favor. Crisp jeans, expensive boots, a flannel shirt too clean to have ever seen real work. He spoke to the driver of the SUV, and though I was a good distance away, their posture told me what I needed to know. This wasn't morning chit-chat. This was business. My business. The man in the flannel raised a rolled-up tube. Maps. The kind surveyors use when they're planning a project. He pointed at the lake, then at the land around it. The SUV driver nodded. The two walked together toward the HOA's walking trail, one that ran far from my boundary, but still offered a view of the water. Something twisted low in my gut. Not fear. Not yet. But recognition. I'd seen that stance before. Developers with plans, eyes shining at the sight of water they didn't yet own. I set my coffee down and grabbed my coat. The path down to the lake crunched beneath my boots. The morning chill stung my cheeks as I approached the shoreline, my eyes fixed on the two silhouettes across the ridge. They didn't see me. They were too busy gesturing toward the lake with the kind of enthusiasm I'd once had when designing water systems for mountain communities. Except my enthusiasm then had been about providing clean water, preventing erosion, keeping land healthy. Theirs was about something else entirely. I followed the shoreline until I reached the bend where the lake narrowed like a funnel. From there, I could hear faint snippets of conversation carried across the still air. Views will raise property values, picnic access, weekend visitors, community asset, community asset. There it was again, that phrase, as if repeating it often enough would make it true. I stepped out from behind the stand of pines, boots snapping a dead twig. Both men turned. The developer's eyes scanned me quickly. My coat, my boots, the lake behind me. He had the look of someone appraising land even when staring at a human being. The SUV driver nodded politely. The developer did not. "You must be Mr. Cole," he said, voice smooth like Riverstone. "I'm Jake Mercer." So this was him. The name I'd seen on half a dozen rumors swirling around town. The man who'd been trying to buy up farmland, old cabins, and any scrap of waterfront he could get his hands on for the last 2 years. "Morning," I said simply. Jake extended a hand. I didn't take it. Not out of rudeness, just because something in my bones told me he wasn't here for pleasantries. He let his hand fall, unbothered. "Beautiful lake you've got," he said, turning to look at it. "Undervalued, really. Tremendous potential." "Potential for what?" I asked. He smiled. A developer's smile. "Community use. Trails, picnic grounds, maybe a rental pavilion. Folks in Pine Ridge would love that." My jaw tightened. Pine Ridge doesn't own this lake. He exchanged a glance with the HOA driver. "Not yet," he said softly. The words slid through the cold morning like a blade. Jake unrolled one of his maps, holding it where I could see. A big red circle encompassed the lake. The entire lake, color-coded as part of an upcoming recreational expansion concept. I felt heat replace the cold in my chest. "Where did you get that?" I asked. "Draft proposal," he said cheerfully. "Bethany's been working closely with us. Says the community is behind it." Behind it, behind taking my lake. I stared at the bright red circle on the map. It looked like a target. Jake continued. "We're looking at the numbers now. Property values in the subdivision could jump 10 to 15% with added lake access." "And where do I fit into those numbers?" I asked. "You." Jake shrugged lightly. "Well, that depends. Some owners prefer to cooperate early. Others need stronger encouragement." His smile widened just enough to be insulting. "But the HOA has processes for handling that." Processes, fines, mailers, pressure from neighbors, manufactured rules. I understood then why Bethany had stormed onto my property so confidently the day before. She wasn't acting alone. She wasn't confused. She wasn't even overreaching. She was preparing the ground for someone else. My blood cooled as the truth settled in. The HOA didn't care about fishing. They cared about ownership. They cared about turning my lake into the key selling point for a development plan worth who knew how many millions, and they needed me to roll over quietly. Jake rolled up his map, slapped the end of the tube against his palm, and nodded toward the water. "You've got something special here, Mr. Cole. Something the community could really benefit from. Now you can either work with us or work against us. But either way," he gave a light shrug, "this lake is changing." "Not while my name's on the deed," I said. He offered a sympathetic smile that didn't hide the threat beneath it. "Well, we'll see about that." They walked back toward the SUV, talking low. The morning sunlight caught the dust drifting behind them, turning it into a golden haze. A beautiful scene, if not for the rot underneath. I stayed at the shore long after they left, staring at the spot where their footprints marked the trail. The lake rippled softly at my feet, a cold, steady heartbeat in the quiet valley. For the first time, the water didn't calm me. It warned me. Bethany's fine wasn't the start of a misunderstanding. It was the first move in a much larger plan. And now I finally understood why the HOA suddenly cared about fishing. Because they wanted the lake. All of it. And they were willing to rewrite the world on paper to make that happen. That thought stayed with me long after Jake Mercer disappeared back toward the subdivision, dust rising behind his truck like a warning signal. I walked the long way home, following the curve of the shoreline, letting the cold wind off the water push the truth deeper into me. Pine needles crunched under my boots. The sky drifted from blue to gray, a thin veil of clouds brushing across the sun as if the land itself were bracing for something. When I reached the cabin, the first thing I heard was the rapid ping of email notifications through the open window. More messages? Already? I stepped inside, wiped the trail dust from my hands, and grabbed my phone from the counter. 12 unread emails, all from Pine Ridge HOA, all sent within the last 40 minutes. That kind of speed wasn't coincidence. I tapped the first one. Community notice. Owner non-compliance. It started politely enough, but the undertone was unmistakable. The HOA claimed I had refused to acknowledge community guidelines regarding recreational use of shared water. The message was worded carefully, legalistic yet vague, timed perfectly to follow my encounter with Jake. The next email came from a different address. Community concerns regarding lake access. This one hinted I was creating an uncomfortable environment for residents attempting to enjoy communal natural features. Communal natural features. They kept shifting the language, inch by inch, nudging a private lake toward public territory, the way a pickpocket nudges a wallet toward the edge of a pocket. I felt my jaw clench. The third email wasn't from the HOA. It was from a neighbor, someone I'd never met. Why won't you let the community use the lake? I stared at the sentence for a long moment, watching the letters blur slightly under the glow of the screen. Not because of tears or anger, just a kind of fatigue that settled deep in my bones. The kind that comes when you realize misinformation moves faster than truth. I opened the next, and the next. A man from the far side of the subdivision accused me of hogging natural resources. A woman complained she'd waited years for lake access and was disappointed one selfish owner could stall progress. Another told me I was standing in the way of something that would help families. Families, progress, community. None of them wrote asking for clarity. None asked if the lake was actually mine. They assumed the HOA's version of reality was the real one. I scrolled until I reached the final message. It was from Bethany herself. We encourage cooperation, Mr. Cole. Escalation is avoidable. No threats, no fines, not even a reference to fishing. Just a sentence sharp enough to cut if you pressed on it. I set the phone down and walked to the sink, turning on the faucet. The water sputtered out cold, clear, untouched by politics or greed. I splashed some on my face, letting the shock of it pull me back into myself. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, carrying the faint creak of the dock shifting in the current. I dried my hands and stared at the wooden counter beneath me. Knotted pine, warm from years of use, carved with faint scratches from tools and fishing gear. A cabin like this wasn't just shelter. It was history. And history didn't bend just because someone mailed a rulebook. But this wasn't going to stop at emails. I felt it in the air. Something heavier building, like a storm assembling behind the ridge. And if I was being honest, a small part of me didn't want to face it alone. So I reached for my truck keys. The drive to town took 20 minutes. The sky had darkened by the time I reached the main road, clouds bunching together like gray wool. Storefronts glowed warm along the narrow street. Hardware store, feed shop, bakery. At the far end, a single-story office with a green metal roof stood quietly under the weight of the coming weather. The brass plate beside the door read, Sarah Mitchell, Attorney at Law, Land and Water Rights. I parked and stepped out, gravel crunching beneath my boots. The air smelled like wet earth, the kind that comes just before rain. Sarah's office lights were on. Through the window I saw her, shoulders straight, hair tied back, glasses perched on her nose as she read something spread across her desk. I knocked lightly. She looked up, recognized me instantly, and opened the door without hesitation. Remy, she said, stepping aside. I figured I'd see you sooner or later. How's that? I asked. She nodded toward a stack of envelopes on her table. HOA letters. A lot of them. I've been getting copies, she said. Bethany's been busy. I exhaled slowly. Busy is one word for it. She motioned for me to sit and poured 2 cups of coffee, hers black, mine with a splash of cream. She remembered. It had been years since I'd talked to her, long before I inherited the ranch. But she wasn't the kind of person who forgot details. All right, she said, sliding into her chair. Start from the beginning. So I did. I told her about the fine, the emails, the developer, the maps, the red circle around the lake like a bullseye. Her expression stayed neutral, calm, professional, but her eyes sharpened the longer I spoke. When I finished, she leaned back, tapping one finger on the desk. That's not random, she said. I know. And not legal. I figured as much. She stood, walking to a tall bookshelf. Pulling down a thick binder, she flipped through its pages. HOA bylaws, state water statutes, land use codes. When she found what she wanted, she tapped the page with her knuckle. Remy, let me ask you something, she said, looking up at me. Who controls the management rights of the lake bed under your property? I blinked. The lake bed? Yes, the bottom, the access rights. Sometimes they split those off in filings. Depends on the county, depends on the era. Did you ever check? No, I admitted. I never thought to. Her eyes narrowed, not at me, but at the situation unfolding around us. She closed the binder, set it aside, and folded her arms. Find out, she said firmly. Because if they're trying this hard to push you out, they may already know something you don't. I felt the room grow heavier around us. Outside, thunder rolled far off in the valley, a low rumble carrying across the plains. A thought crept into my mind. Quiet, cold, unwelcome. Maybe the lake wasn't the only thing they were circling. I met Sarah's eyes. What exactly are you saying? She didn't look away. That you need to find out who holds those rights, she said, and you need to do it fast. I nodded slowly, the words sinking deeper than I expected. Sarah didn't ask how I felt. She asked one question, and it changed everything. Who controls the rights to the lake bed? The words hung in the air like the last echo of thunder rolling off the mountains. I sat there in her office, staring at her, feeling the weight of that question settle into me like a stone dropped into deep water. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of her old desk lamp filled the silence. The smell of brewed coffee drifted between us. Outside, the wind rattled the metal sign above her door, the one that squeaked every time a storm approached. Finally, I broke the silence. I assumed the lake bed was included with the land. Sarah shook her head. Assumptions don't hold up in court, especially not when an HOA is preparing a paper trail. I leaned back in the chair. Are you telling me they might already control it? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood, walked to a filing cabinet, and pulled out another binder, thinner than the first, but stamped with a county seal. She opened it to a page marked with a yellow tab. I'm telling you, the lake bed may have been recorded separately during a prior sale. Some parcels in this region were split decades ago by owners who didn't think long-term. Sometimes access rights, water rights, and bed rights don't match. And HOAs love exploiting gaps like that, I muttered. She gave a small, grim smile. They love paperwork more than water itself. I exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of my neck. The headache forming behind my eyes wasn't from lack of sleep. It was the realization that this might be bigger, much bigger, than some bogus fishing fine. HOA presidents didn't pull developers into secret lakeside meetings unless there was something significant to gain. And if Sarah was right, the lake bed could be the missing puzzle piece. You need to go to the county registrar, Sarah said firmly. Request every record tied to the lake. Transfers, easements, parcel splits. Everything. Don't leave until you know exactly what you own. And if I don't like the answer? She closed the binder slowly. Then you'll know what they're really after. The drive back to the ranch felt longer than usual. The sky had turned that mottled gray-blue that happens before sunset in Wyoming, when clouds drift low and swollen across the valley. The wind picked up grit and carried it in scattered gusts across the road. My tires crunched over it, leaving long, shifting trails behind me. As I pulled onto my long gravel driveway, I noticed something odd. A car parked near the bend, silver sedan, unfamiliar, positioned half-hidden behind a cluster of lodgepole pines. The engine was off. No one sat inside. But the vehicle didn't belong to any neighbor I knew, and I knew them all. Out here, if you lived within 5 miles, you were still a neighbor. I slowed the truck but didn't stop. Whoever owned that sedan hadn't expected me back so soon. Or maybe they had. Maybe they were waiting or watching. When I reached the cabin, I grabbed the mail from the box out front, a fresh stack already poking through the slot. Envelopes stamped with the HOA's logo. 3 this time. A new daily record. Inside, I dropped the pile on the table. The thud echoed in the quiet room. Then I sat, opened the first one, and felt my pulse quicken. Community Recreational Update, Lake Access Rollout Plan. There was a colored map inside, almost identical to the one Jake Mercer had flashed at me the day before. But this one was even more polished. Trails marked in dotted lines, picnic zones highlighted in green, parking proposed near the South Ridge, the entire lake circled in soft blue shading. Community water. The second letter was shorter. Owner notification. Non-compliance will result in additional fines. And the third, I froze when I read the subject line. Shared water transition timeline. Transition. A word so confident, so final, it felt like a shove. I set the letters down carefully, like they might explode if dropped too quickly. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. The lamp over the table flickered as the wind pressed against the windows. I stood, walked outside, and let the door close behind me with a hollow wooden thud. The lake stretched out before me, darker now under the clouded sky. The water moved in soft ripples brushing the pebbled shore. The wind brought the faint scent of rain mixed with the clean, earthy smell of wet soil. This lake had saved me once, pulled me through the toughest chapter of my life. I'd built the dock with my bare hands, sanded every board, sealed the wood until it gleamed like honey under the sun. I'd spent evenings here listening to the world quiet down, cast lines into the water on mornings when my hands still shook from grief. This place wasn't an amenity. It wasn't a feature. It wasn't a bullet point on a developer's proposal. It was home. Lightning flickered in the distance, too far to hear thunder yet. The sky's edge glowed faintly with the electric charge before dusk. I rested my hands on the railing of the dock and felt the grain of the wood under my palms, smooth in some places, rough in others, worn by weather and time. I needed answers, real answers, and I knew where to start. Back inside, I grabbed the old metal lockbox where I kept the deed. As I lifted the lid, the faint metallic scent hit me, aged steel and paper. I pulled the deed out, unfolding it slowly along the crease lines. Each fold whispered with that dry, papery sound that always reminded me of courthouse halls. I studied every line, tracing my finger along the boundary markers. Then I stopped. There was a reference at the bottom, one I'd overlooked for years because it didn't seem important at the time. Lake bed rights, see additional filing. My chest tightened. Additional filing could mean anything. A companion document, a historical split, a restoration of rights, or something else entirely. I grabbed my jacket. Tomorrow morning I was going to the county registrar. But tonight, I needed to know whether the HOA knew something I didn't. I walked back outside, the cold wind slapping my face awake. My boots crunched across the path leading to the ridge overlooking the subdivision. The sky had turned ink dark except for the low glowing line on the horizon. From up here, I could see the rooftops of Pine Ridge Estates. Perfect lines, identical silhouettes, porch lights arranged like stepping stones leading into a future I wanted no part of. Then I saw movement. Several people gathered in one driveway. Voices carried faintly in the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but their glances up the ridge said enough. The way they stood together said even more. HOA meetings weren't scheduled this late. This wasn't a meeting. This was a conversation about me. I stood there until the cold numbed my hands, then headed back toward my cabin. The lake shimmered in the dim light, the wind dragging ripples across the surface. One question circled in my mind, echoing louder than the distant thunder rolling through the valley. If the HOA and Jake Mercer had already targeted my lake, what did they know about that missing filing? And more importantly, why hadn't they expected me to look for it? In the dark quiet of the Wyoming night, the answer felt close, closer than I wanted. Morning broke with a cold, metallic sky, the kind that made every sound sharper, every breath visible. A thin veil of frost clung to the porch railings as I stepped out, coffee steaming in my hand. The lake shimmered pale under the early light, its surface smooth except for a few ripples drifting toward the dock. The world looked clean, untouched. But the truth wasn't. I drove into town at first light, the old truck rattling as it climbed the ridge road. A gust pushed dust across the windshield, blurring the pine-lined slopes for a moment. The county courthouse sat near the center of town, a sandstone building with a weathered flag that snapped sharply in the wind. Inside, the halls smelled like old paper, cleaning solution, and cold air trapped between thick stone walls. The registrar's office was at the end of the corridor, its frosted glass door glowing softly from the lights inside. A woman at the counter, gray hair pulled back, glasses dangling from a chain, looked up as I approached. "Morning," she said. "Research request?" "Yes, ma'am. Parcel filings for Coal Ranch, especially anything referencing water rights, easements, or lakebed ownership." She gave a sympathetic half-smile, the kind clerks give when they've seen trouble walk in before. "HOA giving you a headache?" "A whole migraine," I muttered. She disappeared into the back room, and the sound of drawers sliding open echoed faintly through the wall. After several minutes, she returned carrying 2 thick folders and 1 surprisingly thin envelope. "These are everything recorded since 1975, she said, tapping the folders. Then she held up the envelope. "This one's older. Most people overlook it." My pulse moved a notch faster. I thanked her, took the documents to a small wooden desk by the window, and began reading. The newer records were exactly as I remembered. Property transfer documents, minor updates to the boundaries when the previous owner added fencing, confirmation of all water rights transferring with the land. But nothing about lakebed rights. I slid them aside and opened the thin envelope. It held a single sheet, yellowed with age, crisp around the edges, a surveyor's seal stamped in bright red ink, the kind they used in the 1960s. Across the top in faded type, "Lakebed parcel, ownership file, 1963. My stomach tightened. The document was only a few lines long. Ownership of the natural lake bed located within Parcel 11B is hereby restored to the property owner of Parcel 11C, contingent upon continuous private stewardship. Parcel 11C was my ranch. Parcel 11B was the plot that later became Pine Ridge Estates. Restored, not transferred, not rented, not shared. Restored. Meaning the lakebed had always belonged to the ranch, only temporarily split because of an old property dispute nearly 60 years ago. When the land was legally reconciled, the lake bed went right back where it belonged. My land. And because the HOA sat on parcel 11B, they never had any claim to it at all. I felt the air inside the room shift. A slow, solid certainty sank into me, deeper than frustration, deeper than anger. They thought the lake bed was forgotten, a ghost filing, a scrap of paper lost to time. But the law never forgets. I read the page again, slower this time, letting each line settle in my bones. The clause about continuous private stewardship meant something too. It meant the lake was never intended to be communal, never meant to be touched by development projects or picnic plans. I folded the document carefully and placed it in my jacket pocket, like something delicate and living. When I stepped outside, the wind had picked up, driving grit across the courthouse steps. The air smelled like pine sap and cold stone. I climbed into my truck and sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel. Someone had known about that filing. Someone had hoped I wouldn't. Someone had counted on it staying buried. And now, everything made sense. The pressure, the fines, the sudden HOA interest after years of silence. They'd built their entire plan on a missing document, a single hinge point they prayed no one would check. On the drive back, the landscape looked different. The ranches rolling past weren't just private property. They were anchors of history, each carrying decades of stories etched into deeds and dusty records. This land didn't belong to the HOA's tidy maps or developer dreams. It belonged to people who worked it, cared for it, understood it. By the time I reached my ranch, the wind had driven ripples across the lake, turning its surface into shifting silver. I pulled up beside the cabin and stepped out, the dirt crunching beneath my boots. Across the water, I saw movement. A familiar figure in a crisp blazer stood near the property line fence, Bethany Reed, clipboard in hand, her posture stiff, her head turning slowly as she surveyed the lake as if she were assessing livestock up for auction. Behind her stood two neighbors from the subdivision, pointing toward the water with hopeful expressions. And behind them, partially hidden by the tree line, was that same silver sedan from the night before. They were planning something bigger than fines, something they thought inevitable. Bethany's voice carried across the field, faint but clear enough. Just a matter of paperwork. Once he cooperates, Lake will transition smoothly. Cooperates. Transition. She laughed lightly, confidently, as if the outcome were already written somewhere. I walked to the ridge nearest them. The ground sloped downward gently, giving me a view of the entire group without stepping into their sightline. The wind carried the smell of lake water and dry grass, the two scents mixing in a way that had always grounded me. I placed a hand on the deed in my jacket pocket. Then I touched the lakebed filing, the one they didn't know I had. The one the law would accept even if the HOA refused to. The one filing that would take their entire plan and break it clean in half. A surge of something cold and steady moved through me. Not anger this time, but certainty. Resolve. This wasn't just about fishing anymore. This was about the lake, its history, its rights, its future. And now I knew exactly what they had overlooked. They still didn't know what I had done. But soon they would. Very soon. The morning of the HOA meeting broke cold and sharp, the kind of Wyoming day when the wind feels like it was sharpened overnight. I woke before sunrise, the cabin still wrapped in blue shadows, and stood by the window looking out across the lake. The water was restless, low waves tapping the shore like impatient fingers. Even the land seemed to sense what was coming. I dressed slow, deliberate, a flannel shirt, worn jeans, boots that had seen more seasons than most HOA presidents had patience. I slid the lakebed filing into a hard envelope and tucked it into my jacket. Then I added the deed, the water rights booklet, and photocopies of every older survey map I had pulled from the courthouse. Paper armor, stronger than any fence, sharper than any argument, and far more dangerous to people who built their world on pretense. By the time I reached Pine Ridge Estates, the meeting hall parking lot was already packed. SUVs lined up in rows, each one gleaming like it had just rolled off the dealership lot. Their owners stood in small clusters, arms folded, voices low. Some glanced my way, others avoided looking at me at all. No greetings, no friendly nods, just quiet judgment built from the misinformation Bethany had been feeding them for days. I walked past them and pushed open the door to the community hall. The interior smelled like the usual HOA staples: burnt coffee, lavender air freshener, and the faint, ever-present scent of anxiety that clings to these places. At the front of the room, Bethany stood behind a folding table draped with a white cloth, her clipboard resting like a throne in front of her. Two other board members flanked her, rigid as fence posts. Behind them projected a large screen showing an agenda slide titled Community Update, Lake Transition and Compliance Review. Transition. There was that word again. Bethany smiled when she saw me enter. Tight, polished, confident in a way that told me she thought the battle was already won. "Mr. Cole," she said smoothly, "thank you for attending. Please take a seat." I didn't sit. Not yet. The crowd filled in behind me, neighbors murmuring like a creek building before a flood. When everyone settled, Bethany cleared her throat and began speaking into the microphone. "As many of you know," she said, her voice honeyed with authority, "we've had some recent concerns regarding community access to the lake. One owner continues to resist compliance despite multiple warnings and fines." Eyes shifted toward me. She continued, "This resistance jeopardizes our community's plans for recreational expansion and may result in penalties for all residents. But we intend to resolve this today." A ripple of frustration moved through the crowd. Someone said under their breath, "Just let the HOA have the lake already." Another muttered, "He's holding us back." I inhaled slowly, exhaled slower. The air felt thick, charged, every sound magnified by the acoustics of the hall. Bethany lifted a printed form with a flourish. "Mr. Cole has been issued an updated fine of $1,000 for continued unauthorized use of community water." Gasps, a few nods of satisfaction. She turned to me. "Mr. Cole, would you like to address the board?" "Yeah," I said. "I would." I walked forward, boots echoing against the polished floor. The crowd fell silent. Bethany stepped back from the microphone like she expected a confrontation, maybe even a meltdown, but I didn't touch the mic. I set the hard envelope on the table. "This," I said, "is what I own." Bethany glanced at it with faux patience. "Yes, your deed. We've reviewed it, and it doesn't change." "This isn't just the deed," I cut in. "This is every historical filing tied to the lake, including the one you forgot existed." Her eyes twitched, just barely. I pulled out the 1963 lakebed document and held it up so the whole room could see. The old paper caught the overhead lights, its faded yellow edges glowing like aged parchment. "This," I continued, "is the lakebed ownership restoration. It predates every home in this subdivision. It predates your HOA. It predates your set of rules by more than half a century." A hush settled across the room. The tension shifted, not toward me, but toward the front table. I laid the document in front of Bethany. "It states clearly that the lakebed was restored to the owner of my parcel. Not shared, not communal, not subject to transition. Mine, permanently." Bethany forced a smile, but her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her clipboard. "That doesn't change recreational access," she said. "The surface water, is controlled by whoever owns the bed, I finished. Wyoming State Code. Water rights follow ownership unless explicitly transferred. They were never transferred. I lifted the water rights booklet next. These documents show every right passed to me when I bought the ranch. And your HOA has no legal authority over any piece of this water. The murmurs returned, this time sharper, cutting through the confidence Bethany had built up. But, she said, voice tightening, the community needs... The community, I am who said, has been misled. I turned to the audience. You've been told this lake is communal. It isn't. You've been told I'm blocking access. I'm not. You've been told I'm refusing to cooperate. I'm protecting what the law says is mine. I let the silence stretch. The wind rattled one of the hall windows. Somewhere a chair creaked as someone shifted uncomfortably. Then I placed the final piece of paper on the table, the older survey map showing the lake long before their subdivision existed. This lake wasn't built for Pine Ridge Estates, I said. Your neighborhood grew around it, not into it. Bethany's face drained of color. One of the board members leaned toward her, whispering urgently. Another stared at the documents as if they were written in fire. I rested my palms on the table. You tried to find me for fishing on water I own. You tried to rewrite the rules to make it look like the HOA had authority. You tried to pressure me through neighbors and emails. But you didn't check your history, and you didn't count on me checking it either. The crowd was completely silent now. All eyes were on Bethany. She opened her mouth once, closed it, then opened it again, each attempt quieter than the last. What? What exactly are you suggesting? She finally managed. That not only do you not control the lake, I said slowly, but you don't even have the right to step on the shoreline without my permission. Not 1 inch of it. A single man in the back let out a low whistle. Someone else muttered, "She really screwed this one up." Bethany's composure fractured. Just a crack, but it was enough. The moment landed. She realized she had lost the lake. I picked up my papers, slid them back into the envelope, and stepped away from the table. The hall stayed silent long after my boots stopped echoing. The truth had finally entered the room, and it wasn't leaving. For a long moment, no one moved. Not Bethany, not the board, not the neighbors packed shoulder to shoulder in the rows of folding chairs. It felt like the air in the hall had thickened, like everyone was suddenly breathing through dust. Then Sarah stood. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked forward from her seat near the back, heels clicking softly on the linoleum. When she reached the table, she placed one hand on the deed I had set down moments earlier and the other on the lakebed documents. "Madam President," she said, addressing Bethany with a calm that hit harder than any anger could, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Bethany swallowed. This meeting is for community governance, not legal." "Unfortunately," Sarah interrupted gently, "your HOA handbook doesn't outrank state law." A few people shifted in their seats. Someone near the left aisle murmured, "Well, she's right." Sarah flipped the deed around so it faced the crowd. "This document," she continued, tapping the signature line with one painted fingernail, "states that Remy owns the land under the lake, the shoreline surrounding the lake, and all riparian rights associated with it. That means any rule the HOA attempts to enforce over the water is irrelevant. You cannot regulate what you do not own." Bethany's jaw clenched. "But the CCRs," she tried. Sarah lifted the water rights booklet next. "The CCRs do not, and legally cannot, override private water rights. Even if they try to imply otherwise," she said, her voice still calm but now edged with steel. The crowd was listening, not breathing loudly, not interrupting, just listening. "But," a man in the front row said, The HOA email said the lake was being transitioned to community. Sarah held up a finger. That email was misleading and likely not reviewed by legal counsel. She let that hang. A few heads turned toward Bethany with new suspicion. Sarah spread the documents across the table like she was laying out cards in a poker game she already knew she'd won. Let me be clear. This association does not own the lake. This association does not have access rights, and this association certainly cannot fine Remy for fishing on water that is, by every statute and filing, under his exclusive control. A low murmur rippled through the room. An older woman whispered to her husband, "So, all the emails were lies?" Someone else said louder, "Then what's been going on here?" Sarah folded her hands. "That," she said, "is the question." Bethany's face flushed bright, her composure fraying. She looked at the board members for backup, but neither of them met her eyes. The man on her right looked down at the table as if he wished he could crawl under it. Finally, Jake Mercer stood. Not from the board table, from the back of the room. He had slipped into the meeting unnoticed, wearing a crisp vest and the expression of a man who'd hoped to see a clear victory, but was now watching it crumble like wet sand. "Bethany," he muttered, shaking his head, "you said this was handled." His voice wasn't loud, but the whole room heard it. Everyone froze, eyes widening. You could practically feel the temperature drop. Bethany spun toward him, whisper hissing, "Sit down, Jake." But it was too late. People were looking back and forth between them. HOA president and developer, connecting dots they didn't even know existed until this moment. The woman 2 seats from me whispered, "Why is he even here?" Another said, "What does he have to do with the lake?" Jake didn't answer any of them. He just buttoned his vest and walked straight out the side door, jaw tight, steps fast. A few neighbors watched him go, puzzled, but most turned right back to Bethany, suspicion growing like thunderclouds over the mountains. The tension inside the hall tightened until you could feel it on your skin. I stepped forward again, not to argue, not to escalate, but to finish this. "I didn't want this," I said quietly. "I didn't want a fight. I didn't want to be your enemy. I moved out here for quiet, for space, for a life where I didn't have to defend every inch of ground I stood on." I gestured toward the envelope still sitting on the table. "But when you try to take something that doesn't belong to you, the law has something to say about it. And so do I." A few nods, a few murmurs of agreement. Even some faces that had been cold to me days ago now softened. Bethany's expression tightened into something brittle, desperate. "You're twisting this," Chatu snapped. "The lake should benefit everyone. That's the purpose of community, not selfish ownership." Sarah stepped in before I could reply. "Community benefit," she said, "does not justify violating private property. And it certainly doesn't justify misleading homeowners about rights you do not have." Bethany glared at her. "Stay out of this." Sarah smiled politely. "I'm his attorney. I'm in it." The board member on Bethany's left cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said nervously, I don't think we can issue that fine anymore." The other board member nodded. "Or the previous ones." "And," Sarah added, "you will also need to retract the emails that mischaracterized Remy's ownership, publicly." A hush fell. Bethany's knuckles went white around the edges of her clipboard. "You can't tell me what to do," she whispered. Sarah lifted the lakebed deed one more time. "No," she said softly, "but the law can." Silence. Deep, heavy, final. Bethany's carefully curated composure shattered in her eyes long before it reached her face. She looked at the documents, the ones she never expected anyone to find, let alone understand, and she saw her authority unravel thread by thread. Her voice came out small. "This isn't over." I nodded. You're right, because I'm not finished. A stunned gasp passed through the room, but I didn't elaborate. Not yet. I simply slipped the envelope under my arm and walked down the aisle toward the exit, the room parting around me like tall grass in a summer wind. Behind me, voices rose, confused, uncertain, angry, embarrassed. The HOA president sat frozen in her chair. The board looked lost, and for the first time since this began, I walked away with the weight lifting instead of growing heavier. They had tried to find me for something they didn't own, and they had just learned what happens when the truth finally stands up. The Wyoming air felt different as I stepped out of the community hall, lighter, clearer, almost new. The sun was dipping low behind the pines, casting long golden beams across the gravel lot. My boots crunched softly as I walked to my truck, the envelope tucked under my arm like a final word. I didn't look back at the building. I didn't need to. Inside those walls, the power dynamic had shifted, quietly, decisively, and without any need for raised voices. A battle that had started at my shoreline ended on a folding table under fluorescent lights. A lake they thought they could rewrite into their possession was now undisputedly, legally, irrevocably mine. The engine rumbled to life, its familiar growl grounding me. I drove the long dirt road home, past the weathered fence posts, past the open fields turning amber in the fading light. The windows were down, letting the soft evening breeze wander through the cab. It carried the smell of lake water and warm pine, a scent that never failed to calm me. When the ranch finally came into view, the scene felt surreal. No neighbors watching. No HOA trucks parked where they didn't belong. No tension hanging in the air. Just my land. My silence. My space. I parked near the cabin and stepped out, the boards of the porch creaking under my weight as I walked toward the lake. The water reflected the sky like a mirror, orange fading to pink, then settling into deep blue as the first stars emerged. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about fines, bylaws, or the next HOA tactic. I was thinking about peace. I made my way to the old cedar shed near the dock, pulled out a thick wool picnic blanket, and slung my fishing rod over my shoulder. The reel clicked softly as it hung against my leg. A couple of glass jars rattled in a nearby crate. Iced tea I'd brewed the night before, chilled naturally by the cold night air. I walked down the wooden steps to the lower shoreline where flat stones met the water. The boards of the dock let out a gentle groan as I stepped onto them. I spread the blanket at the end of the dock, careful and slow, letting the fabric settle. The wood was cool beneath my hands. The lake lapped softly against the posts, steady, rhythmic, alive. I sat down and exhaled. Not a heavy breath, a free one. The fishing line cast out in a smooth arc, landing with the quietest ripple. The bobber drifted lazily, carried by the faintest movements beneath the surface. The breeze brushed against my face, carrying with it the cool smell of deep water. Behind me, the ranch stretched wide and open, the fence line running straight until it disappeared into the tree line. My cabin windows glowed faintly. A hawk crowed somewhere above the ridgeline. Crickets hummed in the tall grass. Everything sounded right again. As I leaned back on my hands, I took in the view the way I had the first week I bought the place. The same quiet, the same beauty, the same sense that I didn't need much more than this. A soft vibration buzzed in my pocket, my phone lighting up with a new message. Sarah Mitchell. County file updated. HOA claims officially removed. You're clear. I smiled. Small, real, steady. I typed back, "Thanks for everything." Her reply came instantly. "You did the heavy lifting, I just read the law." I slipped the phone away. No more notices, no more threats, no more HOA pretending they owned what they didn't. just the stillness of my lake under an open Wyoming sky. As the stars sharpened overhead, I poured a jar of iced tea, held it up for a quiet toast, and let the cool sweetness settle on my tongue. To peace, to patience, to the quiet power of the truth. I lay back on the blanket, listening to the gentle rhythm of the water beneath the dock, and let the moment take its full shape. This wasn't just my lake. It was my refuge, my responsibility, my proof that justice doesn't need noise. It just needs the right paper, the right timing, and someone stubborn enough not to give up. Tomorrow, life would go on. The HOA would move on. The neighbors would forget the drama. But tonight? Tonight was mine. The lake was mine. And the peace, earned, defended, quiet, complete, was mine too. Sometimes standing your ground is quiet work, but it still matters. If you've ever had to fight for what's yours, drop a simple yes down below so I know I'm not alone out here. And if stories of justice, land, and a little hard-earned peace speak to you, feel free to subscribe and ride along for the next one.